April 1945. A cold wind moves across a shattered German crossroads west of the Ruhr. The sky is pale. It's washed in the color of smoke, and the last sounds of retreat have already faded into the hills. What remains is silence, and uneasy, suspended silence that follows armies when they finally stop fighting. Along the roadside, a small group of German female auxiliaries stand in their field gray uniforms, hands raised, waiting for the American patrol approaching them. Their faces are smeared with fatigue, their boots dusted with days of marching. For years they carried radios, decoded signals, filled command posts with the steady rhythm of clerical work that kept the Wehrmacht moving. Now they stand motionless, watching the Allied soldiers step closer. Rifles lowered, but alert. The order comes quietly. Almost mechanically, they are told to remove their badges. Every eagle, every swastika, every rank pin fixed to their collars and cuffs. Some hesitate. Some obey instantly. Others look down as the metal insignia trembles in their hands. For the first time, their uniforms no longer mean protection, purpose, or belonging. They have become symbols they must shed. In this moment, heavy with silence, leads into the deeper story of how such humiliation became inevitable. To understand why the removal of insignia carried such weight, one must return to the structure of the German war machine that shaped these women long before surrender lines formed on Europe's roads. From 1939 onward, as Germany expanded its fronts and stretched its manpower, the regime turned increasingly to women to fill the vast network of administrative and technical roles that sustained the Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and even certain SS branches. They were the Helferinnen, the auxiliaries, nearly 500,000 by the war's final year, trained to operate radios, decode encrypted messages, transcribe orders, handle logistics, and maintain the relentless flow of communication that modern warfare demanded. Asterisks, their roles were not decorative. The German command system depended on speed and precision. Signals units, command headquarters, air defense networks. Many functioned because young women sat for hours at switchboards or typewriters, relaying the directives that shaped battles hundreds of kilometers away. The regime understood their importance, and so it placed these women under strict military discipline. They were issued uniforms. They lived in barracks. They swore obedience. And they wore the insignia of the Reich, the eagle, the swastika, the lightning bolt symbols of the communications corps. For them, a badge was not only part of a uniform, it was a statement of belonging inside a tightly controlled system. Asterisk, by 1944, this world had begun to fracture. The Allied landings in Normandy, the Soviet advances toward Poland, the collapse of Italian front siege events sent tremors through the German war structure. Bombing raids intensified. Supply lines strained. Headquarters relocated again and again as the front lines shrank. Many Helferinnen were transferred from relative safety into areas where artillery duels and collapsing defenses became a daily reality. Asterisk, yet the regime pushed them further. In Berlin, young women staffed flak control rooms under constant bombardment. In the Ruhr, they managed the communications networks of units desperately trying to hold back converging American forces. In East Prussia, they served alongside formations that were dissolving under Soviet pressure. Their uniforms still carried the polished symbols of a state that insisted it would endure, even as defeat approached with undeniable clarity. Asterisk, but symbols grow heavier when reality collapses. Through the winter of 1944-45, the German auxiliaries witnessed scenes that had once been unthinkable inside the propaganda. The framework of their early service, hardened soldiers retreating, civilians fleeing, roads choked with vehicles moving not toward battle, but away from it. Command posts abandoning equipment they could no longer defend. The image of the invincible Reich was eroding, replaced by exhaustion and survival instincts. Asterisk, and then came the moment that changed. Everything. Capture. Asterisk for male soldiers. Surrender meant laying down weapons and watching their ranks dissolve. For female auxiliaries, it meant something different. Asterisk. By 1944. Removing badges was standard operating practice swift, controlled and uncompromising. Asterisk for female auxiliaries. This created a moment unlike anything they had trained for. Many had been told they were non-combatants, that their work was administrative, protective, technical. Yet Allied forces often categorized them as military personnel, especially in communications units or air defense networks. Their uniforms placed them in a legal space between support role and armed service. And so, the Americans, British, Canadians, Soviets, and even French units that encountered these women applied the same initial measures: confiscation of documents, disbanding of unit formations, and the enforced removal of every emblem tied to the Nazi state. Asterisk, some surrenders were orderly. Groups of Helferinnen marched out of command posts, hands raised, and followed instructions without protest. Others were chaotic, frantic retreats ending in sudden encounters with Allied patrols, roadside checkpoints, or improvised holding areas. In these moments, the distance between ideological propaganda and lived reality became painfully clear. The once structured identity the regime had imposed upon them dissolved as badges fell from uniforms into the mud. Asterisk, the Allied soldiers enforcing these orders often viewed the situation through practical eyes. They saw uniforms that mirrored the apparatus of the enemy. They saw symbols their nations had been fighting for years to defeat. Many had witnessed the consequences of the ideology those symbols represented in camps newly liberated, in towns devastated by occupation, in civilians fleeing violence. To them, insignia were not cloth or metal. They were declarations of allegiance to a system responsible for immense suffering. Asterisk, and yet, the women who wore them were not a single uniform category. Among the thousands captured in the final months of the war were individuals with vastly different motivations and experiences. Some had joined willingly, driven by nationalist sentiment or ideological enthusiasm. Others had been encouraged or pressured by local labor offices, schools, or family expectations. A significant number sought economic stability in wartime Germany, or saw military service as a way to escape restrictive domestic roles. Their stories varied, but their uniforms made them appear the same. Asterisk, the humiliation associated with removing insignia stemmed not only from Allied command protocols, but from the collapse of identity that followed. Within the Reich, uniforms had granted status, belonging, and clarity. Stripped of them literally, and symbolically, many auxiliaries confronted an abrupt redefinition of self. They were no longer parts of a disciplined system. They were detainees, subjects of interrogation. Individuals accountable for whatever the war would demand in its aftermath. Asterisk. This tension was intensified by the social norms of the period. Women in uniform were highly visible in the Third Reich, both celebrated and scrutinized. They had been portrayed as the efficient hands behind Germany's military power, disciplined and essential. But these same portrayals now worked against them. Allied perceptions of female auxiliaries often included uncertainty. Were these women ideological participants? Passive functionaries were simply caught in a machine they could not control. The act of removing insignia became a way of cutting through ambiguity, a process of neutralization that treated every auxiliary the same, regardless of her past. Asterisk in the West. This procedure was often conducted with firm, detached professionalism. In the East, under Soviet forces, the experience could be far harsher, with consequences shaped by years of brutal conflict and unimaginable loss. Yet across all fronts, the moment of removing badges marked a turning point, an outward sign that the Reich's command structure was dissolving faster than its propaganda had ever admitted. Asterisk, by the final weeks of the war, pockets of auxiliaries surrendered across collapsing fronts. In the Ruhr pocket, where tens of thousands were encircled. In Berlin, where communication posts operated until the last possible hours. In Italy, where retreating German units fell back toward the Alps. And in the remnants of the Western Front, where disorganized columns wandered into Allied lines seeking safety from the chaos behind them. Asterisk, the result was a consistent pattern. Documented in field reports and interviews, Uniforms transformed from instruments of authority into sources of shame. In this single act, the removal of insignia represented the collapse not just of military structure, but of the ideological world these women had lived within, asterisk as the layers of context fall into place. The story now widens into multiple angles through which this moment can be understood. Asterisk. When the order came to remove badges, the moment cut far deeper than the medal itself. Many of these women had entered service in their late teens or early 20s, shaped by a society that bound personal identity to duty, structure, and uniformity. Inside the German wartime system, a uniform was not merely clothing, it was a framework for understanding oneself. It offered purpose, hierarchy, and daily certainty in a world defined by upheaval. So when they stood before Allied soldiers, hands trembling as they unpinned eagles and swastikas, the humiliation was not only fear of punishment, it was the sudden collapse of the identity they had inhabited for years. Their badges had once told them who they were: radio operators, signal specialists, clerks. Logistics aides were woven into the machinery of a country at war. But in 1945, removing those symbols meant stepping outside the only structure many of them had ever known. They felt exposed, not simply because they were surrendering, but because the world they believed themselves part of had evaporated. This was not ideological collapse, for all some remained loyal. Some indifferent, some disillusioned long before. But the human experience was universal. The sharp, undeniable moment when they realized the war had taken not only nations and lives, but the very identities ordinary people had built around its demands. From the Allied side, the act was procedural, clear, direct, non-negotiable. By 1944, Allied command structures had learned the dangers of allowing enemy insignia to remain visible during surrender. Insignia carried authority. They could imply rank where none should remain, encourage cohesion among prisoners, or even enable covert organization inside temporary holding areas. Field manuals and procedural briefings emphasized stripping captured personnel, male or female, of all Nazi symbols immediately. The goal was simple: eliminate any perception of continued command or loyalty to Allied soldiers, especially those who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, or Italy. The symbols of the Reich were far more than decorative emblems. They were the visual language of the enemy, the same motifs painted on vehicles firing at them, stitched onto uniforms of formations that had resisted every advance. Thus, when female auxiliaries surrendered, the removal of insignia was carried out with the same seriousness as disarming frontline infantry. Even if these women held no rifles, they occupied an integral place in the German military apparatus. Signals units, clerical centers, communications networks, these were the nodes that kept armies functional. This understanding shaped Allied behavior. The badges came off not out of personal spite, but from a practiced recognition that uniforms still implied authority long after a battle ended. In this way, the action was less humiliation by intent and more a reflection of how modern armies understood the power embedded in symbols. For the Nazi state, symbols were never incidental. They were engineered, designed to convey power, unity, and ideological purity across every aspect of military and civilian life. The German eagle atop the swastika, the black android patches, the lightning bolt signals insignia, the runic symbols used by acephalated units. Each element of design served a purpose. These symbols bound individuals to a collective identity, reinforcing the belief that the state was eternal, unbreakable, destined to dominate. Women in auxiliary roles learned to treat these symbols with reverence during training. They saluted, stood at attention, and wore them as representations of national pride. Thus, the forced removal of insignia carried a weight far beyond material value. It represented the dismantling of an entire ideological framework, not in a speech, not in a proclamation, but in a quiet moment when someone ordered them to strip away the iconography they had been taught to honor. For many auxiliaries, this confrontation with reality, the realization that the once untouchable symbols could be taken from them without resistance, signaled the collapse of the ideological world that had shaped their youth. It was the beginning of a psychological shift. that would deepen in the days and months following surrender. As the magnitude of the regime's crimes became undeniable, the badges falling to the ground were more than metal. They were the sound of an ideology losing its final hold on the people who had once worn its emblems with confidence. For the Allied soldiers who issued the order, the moment held its own complexity. They were young men Americans, British, Canadians, many scarcely older than the auxiliaries standing before them. They had spent months or years advancing through towns crushed by artillery, past mass graves unearthed on the edges of camps, and through villages that bore the marks of forced labor and occupation, asterisk to them. The insignia worn by these women represented the machinery that had put Europe through 6 years of devastation. A badge was not simply a badge. It was a reminder of comrades buried along hedgerows, of civilians caught in crossfire, of entire cities leveled by war. Asterisk thus. When they demanded that Nazi emblems be removed, they did so not with theatrical anger, but with the clarity of men who understood what those symbols had justified. Some soldiers viewed the auxiliaries with suspicion, unsure whether they had been firmly ideological or simply swept into service. Others saw them as people trapped in a system that had swallowed countless lives. Regardless of role or conviction, asterisk but procedure was procedure. Insignia came off. Documents were collected. Individuals were separated from the identity projected by their uniforms. Asterisk for these soldiers. The act was less personal than definitive, a necessary line between an enemy that had fought fiercely until the last hour and a post-war world that needed order, stability, and truth. It was a controlled dismantling of the visual language of the Third Reich, carried out one collar, one sleeve, one badge at a time. Angle 5. The gendered dimension asterisk. The humiliation experienced by female auxiliaries cannot be separated from the gender. Norms of the 1940s, women in military uniforms were still an anomaly in most Allied countries. Their German counterparts, however, had been a visible part of the war machine, disciplined, uniformed, and integrated into critical operations. Asterisk, this visibility made their surrender more complicated. Female prisoners attracted attention in ways male prisoners did not. Their uniforms, once symbols of precision and pride, became markers of a defeated regime worn on bodies that society still expected to remain modest, domestic. An apolitical asterisk removing insignia stripped them not only of military identity, but of the controlled, regimented image the regime had cultivated around them. Some auxiliaries tried to hide their badges out of embarrassment. Others clutched them tightly. Even after being ordered to surrender them, codes of a pride that war had shattered, but not fully extinguished. Asterisk. The moment of enforced removal also exposed the vulnerability of women who had served inside a system that promised protection, but vanished when defeat approached. In male units, surrender often meant joining thousands of others who shared the same fate. Female auxiliaries, however, were fewer, scattered, and much more visible. They felt judgment more acutely. They feared retaliation, social, moral, and physical. Asterisk thus, the humiliation was deeply gendered. It struck at the intersection of identity, society, and vulnerability, leaving many women to confront not only the collapse of the Reich, but their exposed place in a world where protection had disappeared overnight. Asterisk in hindsight. The moment of badge removal stands at the crossroads of accountability and collapse. The Third Reich had built its identity on symbols, rigid, striking emblems meant to represent ideological purity and absolute loyalty. These badges, worn on the uniforms of both combatants and auxiliaries, became inseparable from the crimes committed under their authority. Asterisk. The Allied insistence on stripping insignia was partly moral. The war had revealed horrors that demanded unequivocal rejection of the ideology behind them. At the same time, the moral burden for the auxiliaries themselves was not simple. Not all of them believed in the ideology they served. Not all understood the full scope of the crimes unfolding around them. Yet they were part of a system that required obedience, and history rarely grants the luxury of separating intention from participation. Asterisk for some women. Removing the badge was an act of relief, a severing from propaganda they had grown to distrust. For others, It was a painful rupture from beliefs they still held. For many, it was something more complicated. A reckoning with the realization that the uniform they once wore with certainty now linked them to a defeated and disgraced state. Asterisk. And it is this tension between personal responsibility, structural coercion, and the collapse of ideology that forms the emotional and historical bridge leading into the decisive events of the final weeks of the war.